The suspended meridian. The Sahara hides a petrified forest the size of Belgium. The 1932 aerial survey was reclassified. In 1932, a French colonial aerial survey team photographed something in the Sahara Desert that appeared in their official reports for exactly 4 years. Then the photographs were reclassified, the survey maps withdrawn from public archives, and the geological designation changed from active research site to restricted military zone. The area covers roughly 30,000 square kilometres in what is now southern Algeria, larger than Belgium. What the survey team photographed was a petrified forest. Not scattered fossilised logs, a forest. Trees standing upright, trunks intact, root systems preserved in place, stretching across an area that would take days to cross on foot. The French geologists who examined the photographs described tree densities consistent with temperate hardwood forests. They recorded trunk diameters exceeding 2 meters, heights estimated at 20 to 30 meters before petrification, and growth patterns suggesting stable climate lasting centuries. By 1936, access to the site was restricted. By 1940, the original survey photographs had been removed from colonial archive indices. By 1962, when Algeria gained independence, the Sahara survey records in French archives contain no reference to forests of any kind in the specified coordinates. The gaps in the file sequence are visible, the documents that should be there are missing. This is an examination of what happens when economic interests and geological evidence occupy the same territory, and why certain kinds of evidence become inconvenient to certain claims. The petrified forest exists. The photographs existed in institutional archives. The restriction orders exist in French colonial records. What does not exist is an explanation for why a geological formation warranted military-level classification in an empty desert. The question is what the forest proves about the Sahara's recent history, and why this proof might be economically inconvenient. Petrification requires specific conditions. The tree must be buried rapidly, usually by volcanic ash or sediment, in an environment with high mineral content. The organic material is replaced molecule by molecule with silica. The process preserves structure down to individual cells, but it requires burial, water, and a specific chemical environment. Recent studies show that under ideal conditions, full petrification can occur in less than 100 years. The silica replacement accelerates in environments with volcanic activity and high mineral saturation. The Sahara had both, so the trees could have been growing as recently as 2,000 years ago. Cut down, buried by sudden sediment, and petrified while Rome still existed. This is standard petrification chemistry applied to a formation that has been photographed, measured, and then made inaccessible. The trees tell us about climate. A forest requires sustained precipitation over decades to establish that density and maturity. The trees were mature specimens. That means stable climate. And stable wet climate in the central Sahara means the desert is younger than the forest that preceded it. This is where the timeline gets interesting because it conflicts with the narrative that has been constructed around Saharan development and resource extraction rights. The official story is this. The Sahara has been a desert for thousands of years. Permanent human settlement was minimal. The territory was empty, climatically hostile, and without significant value until oil exploration in the 1950s revealed petroleum deposits beneath the sand. The colonial powers that controlled the region before independence were merely administering empty land with no prior claims of significance. This is the narrative that makes modern resource extraction agreements politically and legally defensible. A petrified forest the size of Belgium suggests something different. It suggests that the Sahara, within a time frame measured in centuries rather than millennia, supported an ecosystem that could sustain large-scale forestation. And forests do not grow without people managing them. Forests of that scale and uniformity imply fire management, water management, selective clearing, and replanting. Forests are not wilderness. Forests are cultivated landscapes. The presence of the forest implies the presence of the cultivation system that maintained it. And the cultivation system implies the people who practiced it. not scattered nomadic groups, settled populations with long-term territorial claims written in centuries of landscape management. Now we arrive at the problem. If the Sahara was a managed forest within the last 2,000 years, then the desert you see now is not a natural baseline. It is a collapse event, and collapse events have causes. Sudden desertification at that scale requires either catastrophic climate shift or systematic deforestation, followed by topsoil loss. The petrified forest, buried rapidly and preserved in place, suggests the former. But the French colonial documents that still exist, the ones that were not reclassified, contain references to extensive charcoal deposits in the same region. Charcoal at depth, in quantities that geologists described as industrial scale burning. Forests do not burn themselves to charcoal in quantities visible from aerial surveys. Forests burn when someone burns them. And when you burn a forest that size in a region that was already climatically marginal, you trigger the process that converts managed landscape into desert. The sand is not natural. The sand is what happens when you remove the trees, and the topsoil has nothing left to hold it in place. So the question becomes, who burned it and when? And why does answering that question matter enough to reclassify a geological survey 70 years after the fact? The answer has to do with resource law. Under international legal frameworks that emerged from European colonial administration, rights to extract resources from a territory depend on whether that territory was empty or occupied when the colonial power arrived. Empty land, terra nullius, can be claimed and exploited without requiring negotiation with prior inhabitants. Occupied land requires treaties, agreements, recognition of prior claims. The difference between these classifications determines who owns the oil discovered beneath the Sahara in the 1950s, who profits from the natural gas deposits mapped in the 60s and 70s, and who controls the mining rights to rare earth elements that satellites have identified in the same coordinates where the 1932 survey photographed a petrified forest the size of a small European country. If the forest existed 2,000 years ago, and if it was managed, and if management implies settled populations, then the Sahara at European contact was not empty. It was recently emptied. The difference is legally significant. The evidence that would prove this difference is a petrified forest that was photographed, documented, and then classified as militarily sensitive during the exact decade when European powers were negotiating the legal frameworks that would govern African resource extraction after decolonization. The timing is the tell. Why does a geological formation warrant military classification? The usual reasons are strategic value or security risk. A petrified forest is neither. It is not a weapons site. It is not a population center. It is not infrastructure. It is trees turned to stone in the middle of a desert that nobody lives in. The only reason to restrict access to that evidence is if the evidence undermines a claim that has financial value. And the claim it undermines is the emptiness of the land. Because emptiness is what makes extraction rights transferable without requiring consultation with the descendants of whoever managed the forest before it burned. Let us talk about the photographs themselves. The 1932 aerial survey was part of a broader French colonial mapping initiative that documented North and West Africa from the air for the first time. The technology was new, the photographs are high resolution for the period, and the French colonial administration, whatever its other failings, kept meticulous records. Archives of that survey exist in Paris. Researchers have documented the archive structure. They have documented the file numbering systems, and they have documented the gaps where the Sahara forest photographs should be, according to the sequential numbering of survey flights. The photographs existed. They were catalogued. They were referenced in internal geological reports that are still accessible in secondary archives. Researchers have documented the archive structure, the file numbering systems, and the gaps where the Sahara forest photographs should be according to the sequential numbering of survey flights. But the photographs themselves, the primary evidence, are not in the public record. Access requests filed by independent researchers in the 1990s and 2000s were denied on grounds that the materials were classified for reasons of national security. When pressed for clarification, the French Ministry of Defense stated that the classification pertained to ongoing agreements with Algerian authorities regarding resource development in the region. Resource development, not military operations, not security risks. Resource development, the photographs of a petrified forest are classified because they are relevant to resource contracts. That is not speculation. That is the official explanation, documented in correspondence between researchers and archival authorities. Now let us consider what that classification protects. If you are negotiating mineral rights in a region, your claim is stronger if the land has no prior occupants with documented territorial claims. Prior occupants are defined by evidence of settlement, cultivation, and long-term land modification. A forest is land modification. A managed forest maintained over centuries is strong evidence of territorial occupation. Remove that evidence from public access, and you remove the basis for challenging the extraction agreements. This is not new. This is the same pattern that played out in the Americas, in Australia, in the Pacific. The legal doctrine of terra nullius required that colonizing powers prove the land they claimed was empty or occupied only by people without recognizable systems of land tenure. Remove the evidence of tenure and you remove the legal obstacle to claiming the land. The Sahara petrified forest is that evidence, and it was removed from public access during the exact period when the legal frameworks for resource extraction were being negotiated. The pattern of absence here is precise. We have survey flights, we have flight logs, we have geological reports referencing forest formations, we have archive numbering sequences with documented gaps, we have classification orders. What we do not have is the photographs themselves or any comprehensive public study of the formation they documented. The absence is patterned. The absence serves a purpose. The absence protects economic claims that would be complicated by the presence of evidence showing that the Sahara was not always a desert and was not always empty. The final question is what happens to the evidence that still exists. The petrified forest is still there. The trees, turned to stone, are not going anywhere. But stone weathers, sandstorms erode, surface formations exposed to wind and temperature variation degrade over time. In the 70 years since the photographs were classified, how much of the formation has been lost to natural erosion? And more importantly, how much has been lost to unnatural causes? Satellite imagery of the region, available through commercial providers since the early 2000s, shows geometric patterns consistent with industrial activity in areas that overlap with the coordinates described in the declassified portions of the 1932 survey. Drilling rigs, access roads, storage facilities, extraction infrastructure. The commercial satellite operators have no obligation to preserve geological heritage. They photograph what is there. What is there now in some of the relevant areas is oil field development actively expanding into zones that historical records suggest once contained sections of the petrified formation. You cannot drill through a petrified forest without destroying it. The wood turned to stone may be hard, but it is brittle. Industrial drilling equipment designed to penetrate bedrock will shatter fossilized wood. If the oil deposits beneath the Sahara are located in the same geological layer as the forest, then extraction operations are erasing the formation as they proceed. And if the formation is erased before independent researchers gain access to document it properly, then the evidence it represents is gone. The stumps are weathering, the photographs are classified, the legal frameworks are already in place, and the drilling continues in coordinates that, according to documents you can still access if you know where to look, once contained a forest that proved the Sahara was not always a desert and not always empty. What remains is the question of who profits from that emptiness, and whether we will figure out what was removed from the record before the last piece of that record turns to dust under the wheels of extraction machinery built to exploit land that was declared empty because the evidence of its previous occupants was made unavailable for review. The trees are still there, turned to stone, waiting in the sand. And the photographs that would prove what they mean are locked in an archive in Paris, classified under agreements that protect not the evidence itself, but the economic arrangements that depend on the evidence remaining inaccessible to independent scientific review. That is not conspiracy. That is documented administrative practice serving documented economic interest. The question is whether you find that arrangement acceptable, and if never, what you do with the knowledge that it exists.